In this episode, we're uncovering the very messed up origins of one of Johnny Depp's most famous characters, that goth weirdo who cuts hair. No, not Edward Scissorhands, the other one, the angrier one. I'm talking about Sweeney Todd, the murderous barber down on Fleet Street. To this day, his origin story might be the most intriguing example of adapting a written work for a new medium that I've ever covered. And in this special, uncut presentation, you'll see why. Well, it was supposed to be uncut until I went and made a mess. Sorry about that. See, most people are familiar with Sweeney Todd through Stephen Sondheim's Broadway musical or Tim Burton's adaptation of the musical for the big screen. But the original Sweeney Todd story was published in a series of penny dreadfuls. Penny dreadfuls were basically the 1800s Victorian equivalent of true crime podcasts. They were pamphlets containing spooky stories about criminals, detectives, and supernatural entities that were released to the public in weekly or bi-weekly installments. The original Sweeney Todd story, known as The String of Pearls, was published across 18 weeks in the winter of 1846 to 1847. And when I say The String of Pearls is nothing like Sondheim's musical, I am not exaggerating. Granted, this should be somewhat expected because stage adaptations always add their own creative spins, and Sondheim's version is technically an adaptation of Christopher Bond's play from 1973, so he wouldn't even have had to read The String of Pearls to write the musical. Regardless, I couldn't help being fascinated with the massive differences and subtle similarities with their plots, because as different as they are, you can still spot the seeds where specific elements and themes sprouted from in the source material. The musical portrays Sweeney Todd as an anti-hero. He's a bad barber who murders his innocent customers so his partner in crime can bake them into pies. His business would be one of the lowest rated on Yelp, but the audience still can't help cheering for him on his quest for revenge against Judge Turpin. Turpin is the sociopath who created this razor-wielding monster by ripping him away from his family and wrongfully imprisoning him for 15 years. Yeah, when you find out that happened to him, you can't help feeling sorry for Sweeney Todd, formerly known as Benjamin Barker. But in the original story, there is no debate that he is a straight-up villain. I will say the author does find some interesting ways to make the reader root for him, but he's still the most evil character in The String of Pearls, which is terrifying when you consider that he may even have been based on a real person. That's right, we have a lot of ground to cover with the origins of Sweeney Todd. Not only are we going to compare and contrast the most iconic versions of his story, I'll also be exploring the many alternate endings to his tale, as well as determine whether or not he was inspired by a real-life serial killer like the internet legends say. It's all going down in this special uncut episode of the very messed up origins of Sweeney Todd. Uncut is a pun because he cuts his victims. So there have been a number of Sweeney Todd adaptations since it was first published back in the 1840s, but I'm going to keep this comparison simple and straightforward. We're looking at three versions of the story: the original String of Pearls penny dreadful, the 1970s musical by Stephen Sondheim, and Burton's adaptation of that musical from 2007. Now, whether you love or hate the Burton version, there are two facts about it that you can't argue with. Number one, it follows the plot of Sondheim's musical almost exactly. Sure, Tim Burtoned all over it, but in terms of the story, it's almost a perfect recreation. Number two, the performances in the Broadway musical are infinitely better than the ones in the movie. And I'm not just saying that to be a snob or pick on Johnny Depp and Helena Bonham Carter. They gave it their best shots, but if you watch any behind-the-scenes footage from the movie, all they talk about is how the whole cast was made up of non-singers and how Tim Burton hates musicals.
It's been really interesting working with Tim on doing this musical. First of all, it's been because I know privately, because I live with him, that he hates musicals. So it's kind of fantastic that he's doing one.
I don't know why he'd bother making a musical if he doesn't like them. These songs in Sweeney Todd are also infamously difficult even for professional singers.
Okay, same place?
It's very difficult to breathe here.
I know.
He hasn't left a lot of room.
He hasn't left a lot of room for breath, has he?
So the decision to cast his wife and long-lost son when neither of them had ever sang before is even more confusing, especially when you consider that he could have recreated Christopher Bond's non-musical version. It just seems to me like he made it unnecessarily hard on himself. But I digress.
Yeah, he thinks that Billy, our son's going to be gay because he listens to Judy Garland and I've just brought him up on musicals.
The point I'm slowly working towards making is that because the musicals are so similar, I'm really just comparing two versions, which is easier. So the Penny Dreadful version, called The String of Pearls, is set in London in 1785. Already, this is different than the musical, which takes place 60 years later in 1846. You might notice that 1846 was the year that the first installment of The Penny Dreadful was published. The musical opens with Sweeney Todd returning to London after his 15-year imprisonment. He was apparently rescued from the water by this young lad named Anthony, who's nowhere to be found in the book. We never learn exactly what crimes he was accused of committing, but it's safe to say those 15 years in exile were about as hard on him as Sirius Black's 12 years in Azkaban. Todd has been reduced to an angry, revenge-obsessed shell of his former self, the man once known as Benjamin Barker. He's at a very different stage of his life than the book version. In the book, Sweeney is not coming off the most traumatic experience of his life. Quite the opposite, actually. He's been getting some easy dubs over the dummies in London for years, and his operation with Mrs. Lovett, where he delivers her the corpses of his customers to bake into pies and sell in her shop, is already in full swing at this point, and business is booming. In the musical, Mrs. Lovett's pies start out terrible. You might even say they're the worst pies in London, and they don't start cannibalizing folks until about halfway through. To be clear, in the book, we don't learn all the details of their scheme until the very end. That's supposed to be part of the mystery, but over the decades, it's become the most iconic part of the musical, so I figure it's pretty pointless for me to try to keep that hidden. I'm still not going to spoil the specifics of their process though, because that is a little different than the musical. So the book opens by introducing the setting and our villain, Sweeney Todd, who's described as a long, low-jointed, ill-put-together sort of fellow with an immense mouth and such huge hands and feet that he was, in his way, quite a natural curiosity, and there never was seen such a head of hair as Sweeney Todd's. We know not what to compare it to. Probably it came nearest to what one might suppose to be the appearance of a thick-set hedge. Honestly, not far off from Johnny Depp's portrayal of the character, though that white streak is giving off some serious goth rock vibes. We're also told that Todd has an awful laugh that sounds like a hyena's, and there's a few different moments throughout the story where people that Todd is talking to are startled to hear him laugh, then ask him not to make that noise anymore. It's a hilarious detail that I wish they included in the play, but I'll get over it. So the catalyst for the book's events happens in the very beginning. A sailor named Thornhill enters Sweeney's shop and is never heard from again. You can probably guess what happened to him, but the book is real sly about it. It only says that Sweeney stepped away from shaving Thornhill to enter his back room, and when he returned, Thornhill had disappeared, leaving behind his hat, his walking stick, and his dog, who was patiently waiting for him outside. Now, this dog would prove to be a problem for Sweeney because he was a very good boy and loyal to his master. So loyal that when a day had passed and Thornhill still hadn't come out of the shop, the dog swam down the river to Thornhill's sailor buddies and dragged them to Sweeney Todd's. If that wasn't clue enough for the sailors that something sus was going on, Sweeney would make it loud and clear for them when he opened his front door just to swing a metal pipe at the dog. Just awful, but it's a pretty hilarious image if you think about it. There's also a great quote from one of the sailors who says, "We must inquire into this. There seems to be mutual ill will between the man and the dog." So the captain of the ship and his men ask Todd if anyone resembling a Navy officer has been to his shop, to which he truthfully answers yes. But then he adds that the officer got into a scuffle at the market and was arrested. That kind of behavior from Thornhill wasn't surprising to his co-sailors, but Todd also told them that Thornhill mentioned a meeting with the daughter of a spectacle maker. With that in mind, they set off to see if they could track down their missing man. But curiously, Thornhill's dog was rooted to his spot in front of Sweeney's shop, so they had no choice but to leave him there. Now, that spectacle maker's daughter I mentioned, her name is Joanna Oakley, and she's the namesake for Sweeney Todd's estranged daughter in the musical. Both versions' plots revolve heavily around her romance, but once again, in different ways. In the book, Joanna is in love with a man named Mark Ingistry, who set sail on a voyage to India exactly 2 years prior. Despite her parents' wishes, she faithfully waited for his return throughout the entire 2 years. The plan was for them to build their life together with the money he made from his excursion. Sadly for Joanna, though, the reason that Thornhill planned on meeting with her after his appointment with Todd was to tell her that her beloved Mark had been killed in a shipwreck. So after Thornhill disappeared, it fell on Colonel Jeffrey to deliver the news. The colonel was on board the ship that rescued Thornhill and his dog from the shipwreck that killed Mark Ingistry, so while he had no personal connection to the couple, he felt it necessary to inform Joanna so the poor girl wasn't waiting around in limbo. But he had more to tell her about than just Mark's death. Apparently, Mark had given Thornhill a very valuable string of pearls to give to Joanna, so Thornhill's disappearance meant the disappearance of the pearls as well. Colonel Jeffrey does manage to meet with Joanna and fill her in on all of this, and to Joanna's credit, she didn't really care much about the valuable string of pearls. She wasn't too concerned about Thornhill either, actually. The only thing she could focus on was the death of her one true love. Joanna in the musical also goes through some romantic issues, but they're of a very different kind. In this version, her mother Lucy was sexually assaulted by the same Judge Turpin who had wrongfully imprisoned her father, and Lucy was so traumatized by the event that she drank poison to commit suicide. After this, Joanna was adopted and raised by Judge Turpin, who sheltered her from the outside world her entire life, then decided he should marry her just to keep her extra safe. Meanwhile, she really wants a relationship with Anthony, the young lad who Todd sailed into London with. So at this point, you've been introduced to all of the main characters and components of the book, as well as their musical equivalents. You have Sweeney Todd and Mrs. Lovett's meat pie scheme, Joanna's hopeless romance with Mark, planting the seeds for her forbidden romance with Anthony, and of course, the string of pearls, which go on to serve as Sweeney Todd's motivation in the same way as his revenge does in the musical. Because somehow, Sweeney Todd found himself in possession of the pearls that Thornhill was supposed to deliver to Joanna, and he learns they're worth about 11,000 pounds, which is roughly 300,000 US dollars in today's money. In other words, it's more than enough for Sweeney to close shop at his murder factory and retire in a faraway land. All he has to do is find a way to sell the pearls and leave town without attracting too much attention. And the story follows him on this journey while Joanna and the sailors try to find out the truth about what happened to Thornhill. If you haven't figured it out yet, there are a ton of moving parts in this story, and as much as I would love to include every little detail because the book is full of great little moments and side stories, this episode would literally be hours long if I did. No exaggeration. So in the next section, we're going to focus more on the musical story and connect every detail to the source material that we can. So you know that dramatic moment at the end of the musical's first act where Mrs. Lovett reunites Sweeney Todd with his razors and he screams really loud about his arm being complete again? Well, I would equate the power that he felt in that moment to when he finds the pearls in the book, because after said events, both versions of Sweeney start sprinting towards their individual goals. In the book, that goal is to sell the pearls in a way that's both untraceable and doesn't force him to answer any questions about where he got them. He tries a regular old jewel broker, but that ends up backfiring when he's asked to show the proper paperwork to prove his ownership. Poor Sweeney has to snatch the pearls back from the jeweler and run home through the most dangerous part of London, where he almost has the pearls stolen from him by other thieves and wannabe heroes who assume that he's running because he's done something wrong. In the movie, Todd's goal is to get revenge on the Londoners who drove his wife to suicide, specifically Judge Turpin and his creepy assistant, Peter Pettigrew. And to build some hype for his shop, he enters a shaving contest with Pirelli, who sells a miracle elixir that smells like piss. Here we have yet another connection to the book in the form of Pirelli's apprentice, Toby. In the original story, there is no Pirelli, but Todd has an apprentice named Tobias Ragg. He's a soft-spoken young man who got the job through his mother. She thinks that Sweeney is just the kindest man, but throughout the story, Sweeney mentally and physically abuses Tobias so that he's too scared to report his suspicions about the barber's crimes to law enforcement. As fans of the musical will know, Toby goes on to work for Todd and Mrs. Lovett as well. After Todd crushes Pirelli in their duel of the shaves, Pirelli realizes that his opponent must be his old master, the infamous Benjamin Barker, who's supposed to still be in prison. He threatens to report Todd to the law unless he pays him half his profits going forward, but Todd doesn't like this idea, so instead, he chooses to murder Pirelli. In the movie, he bashes his brains in with a tea kettle, while in the stage play, he strangles him. In both versions, they slit his throat to finish the job. With Pirelli having disappeared without a trace, poor Toby has no choice but to live and work for Mr. Todd and Mrs. Lovett. Meanwhile, the need to dispose of Pirelli's body gives these two psychos their genius business idea, baking people into pies, and soon enough, their bakery is the talk of the city. Now remember me mentioning that your boy Judge Turpin is trying to marry Joanna, his adoptive daughter? Well, you might be surprised to hear this, but she thought that idea was kind of gross, so she set up a plan with Anthony to rescue her before that happened. Only problem was that Turpin found out about that scheme, so to make sure that no man ever see Joanna again, he has her locked up in a madhouse. Once again, we have an element from the book, the madhouse, but it's used in a completely different way. In the book, we follow Sweeney's apprentice, Tobias, as he slowly starts to crack under the pressure of knowing his boss is doing something evil, but also being too frightened to investigate it or tell anyone. Sweeney had beaten him every day since he started working for him weeks prior, and worse, Sweeney was threatening to report Tobias's mom to the law for stealing a silver candlestick from a rich man whose house she cleaned. Let's go, come on. Think Gunther's taking on some co-host responsibilities. You're gonna have to if you want to keep coming on camera like this. Todd tells Tobias that his mother will be hanged if the law finds out, and Tobias is just too scared to risk that being true. What he doesn't know is that it was really Sweeney who stole the candlestick, and Tobias's mom brought it back to the rich man to save him from being hanged. Like I said, Sweeney Todd is no anti-hero in this story. He's straight up evil. Do you have to do that right now? It's not like I'm a meat pie. So one night, when Sweeney has left his shop to try selling the pearls at another pawnbroker, Tobias hits his breaking point and forces his way into the back room at the barbershop to find out what his boss has been up to. He doesn't find any bodies, but lo and behold, he finds dozens of ornate walking sticks, hats, jewelry, even swords. And that's enough evidence for him to decide that Sweeney Todd is murdering his customers. He doesn't know how because Todd has sent him out of the shop on errands whenever a potential victim has walked in, but he does know he has to get the hell out of there. Only poor Tobias doesn't make it very far. When Todd gets back from the pawnbroker, he sees that his back room has been broken into and ambushes Tobias at his mom's house. Then, when Mrs. Ragg sees how panicky and frazzled her son is, she trusts Todd with taking him to a madhouse for treatment. Here's the really messed up thing though. This isn't the first time Todd has had one of his apprentices locked up. When the previous young lad working for him got wise, Todd just bribed the madhouse to take him in, and they killed him. It's scary to think that something like that was possible back in the day. Later in the story, we meet another woman in the madhouse who is set to inherit a bunch of money from her aunt, but her parents wanted it, so they had her declared insane before she was old enough to receive it. It's crazy. We're in the middle of a story where people are being killed and cooked into pies, and that's arguably not even the darkest element in it. Anyway, while we're on the subject of people being locked up, I should tell you that this entire time, your adorable dog Copper has been locked in my oven. Okay, not really, but I do kind of hope that at least one of you has a dog named Copper that you maybe hadn't seen in a while, so you thought, whoa, did he really kidnap my dog? I would never, but there really is one other character who's being imprisoned against his will, besides Joanna and Tobias. You haven't met him yet. He's Mrs. Lovett's assistant. Like I mentioned, Lovett's Pie Shop is London's premier meat pie palace from page 1 of the book, and she needs a helping hand to satisfy all those customers. But remember, Lovett's pies are made out of people, so the only way to keep those herbs and spices a secret is to make sure that whoever's helping her can't tell anyone. And the only way to do that is by imprisoning them in the bakehouse. Lovett chooses her assistants using a similar strategy to the one Sweeney uses to choose his victims. When an outsider or newcomer to London, someone without any loved ones to check in on them, stops by her shop asking for work, she leads them into the bakehouse. She tells them you can live here as long as you want and eat as many pies as you want, but there are 2 rules. Make the pies when I tell you, and as long as you work here, you can't ever leave. And usually these desperate individuals would accept her offer, assuming they could leave when they quit the job. Oh, but how wrong they were. Whenever an assistant stopped cooperating or figured out that the meat they were stuffing into pies was human, Sweeney would enter the bakehouse through a hidden entrance and crush their skull with a hammer. Then the former assistant would be baked into pies by the next poor schmuck they lured down there. We aren't told much about our current assistant, but at this point in the story, he's been down there for a few weeks, and as you can imagine, he's starting to lose his cool. He still hasn't realized that he's making people pies, but he's found some creepy-ass messages written on walls and scraps of parchment claiming that anyone who stops cooking will have their throat slit during the night. So while he may not know much, he's pretty sure that if he wants to live, he has to keep working. And in the meantime, he'll have to find a way to break out of the underground labyrinth that he's been locked inside of. As different as the original story is from the musical, their plots follow a very similar formula. They start off kind of slow, but their momentum builds fast, and their third acts are a whirlwind of plot twists and revelations that culminate into an epic conclusion. If you haven't heard either of these stories before, you're in for a roller coaster ride with this episode. Just be sure to stay until the end because the payoff is worth it. This pearl necklace is what sets the entire plot in motion, a fact I find very interesting considering there is no pearl necklace to be found in the musical, though Helena Bonham Carter looks like she's ready for one.
Oh, that's gross.
Now, Sweeney Todd was a clever fellow and managed to come up with an excellent strategy for exchanging these pearls for cash. After paying a considerable amount to buy extravagant clothes, rent a stagecoach, and make himself look unrecognizably fancy, he swindled a pawnbroker into lending him £7,500 and holding on to the pearls as insurance. After his successful hustle, Sweeney returned to his shop to find that his apprentice, Tobias, had broken into his back room and discovered the piles of loot he'd collected from his victims. So he kidnapped the boy and bribed the evil Dr. Fogg to lock him up in his madhouse. I believe that this inclusion of the madhouse is what inspired its use in the musical, when Sweeney's estranged daughter Joanna is locked up by her sexually repressed adopted father, who is real mad she didn't want to marry him. Both Tobias and Joanna make some pretty epic escapes too. In the musical, Anthony follows Sweeney's plan of sneaking into the madhouse Agent 47 style and donning the disguise of a wig maker. He requests blonde hair, which Joanna has, then he holds the doctor at gunpoint to get her out of there. An interesting difference between the two musicals is that in the stage play, Anthony drops his gun and Joanna shoots the doctor herself, while in the movie, they leave the doctor to be torn apart by the remaining inmates. Either way, Dr. Fogg gets his karmic deliverance. In the book, Tobias's escape is a bit more messy. After the door of his cell is accidentally left unlocked by one of the guards, he sneaks into a woman's cell nearby, and together they escape Andy Dufresne style through a tunnel that she had dug with her bare hands. That tunnel brought them to an abandoned gardening shack in the madhouse yard, and their last obstacle was to scale the high wall that surrounded the asylum, which they were prepared for. Tobias climbs up a nearby tree, carefully pulls himself onto the wall, then ties the rope they made from torn-off quilt around the great big iron spikes on top of the wall. Next, he watches with bated breath while his fellow escapee starts to climb up the rope. But just as she was about to reach the top, the rope snapped and she fell hard onto the ground below. Then, the worst case scenario happened. Suddenly, the lights in the guardhouse turned on, and angry shouts broke the dead silence of night. Tobias stared down at the woman from his perch on the wall, and he knew that trying to save her would just get them both killed. So instead, he turned himself away from the asylum and fell, rather ungracefully, on the rocks and dirt below. He was bloody and he was bruised, but Tobias Ragg had just earned his freedom, so he started to run towards London, where he thought that he would be safe. Not quite as smooth an exit as Joanna and Anthony's, but their nightmare is only just starting. We have officially reached the grand finale of the musical, where the truth is finally revealed and everyone bleeds everywhere. At least that's how it goes in Tim Burton's adaptation. The stage play has surprisingly little blood for being about a killer that slits people's throats. More squeamish folks might think that Burton indulged in the blood a little too much. I mean, there's enough of it that I can't even show you the full footage without YouTube age restricting this video, but I do like his rationale for upping the gore effects. He said that everything is so internal with Sweeney that the blood is like his emotional release. It's more about catharsis than it is a literal thing. I mean, it looks pretty literal to me, but that's a cool way to think about it. The fountains of blood are the visual representation of Sweeney's internal suffering being released. So at this point in the musical, all of the plot's moving parts crash into each other. Toby, Lovett and Todd's assistant, is starting to put together that Mr. Todd has been up to no good, a lot like Tobias in the original story. And to make sure that he doesn't go to the law with this information, she lures him into the bakehouse under the guise of finally letting him help her bake. But what he doesn't realize is that she's just gonna lock him in there until Mr. Todd decides how to deal with him. After Toby is locked up, Judge Turpin's personal butt plug, Beetle Bamford, shows up at the shop because of complaints about a bad smell coming from their chimneys. So Todd lures him up to his shop and kills him. Then he sends his body down to the bakehouse and scares the shit out of Toby, who realizes that he's probably next and that he should hide. That was some good thinking on his part because not long after, Todd and Lovett enter the bakehouse to try and find him. Meanwhile, Anthony drops off the freshly rescued Joanna, who's now disguised as a young lad, at the barbershop while he looks for a ride out of town. It's at this moment that the crazy homeless lady arrives, and I'm ashamed to admit that I've neglected to mention the crazy homeless lady anywhere in this presentation. But in my defense, she hasn't done a whole lot so far besides creep around and whisper to herself. Though I did notice that she's considerably hornier in Sondheim's play than in Burton's version. She spreads her legs for Anthony on more than one occasion, and somehow he resists these tempting offers. Anyway, while Joanna is waiting in the barbershop, she hears the crazy lady approaching and hides in the same trunk that once hid Pirelli's body. And not long after the lady enters, Sweeney shows up. He doesn't know who this broad is, but she gives him a look like she recognizes him and asks, "Don't I know you, mister?" But before Sweeney even registers what she said, he hears the judge approaching, and in a rush to get rid of the woman, he slits her throat and sends her body into the shaft below. Mere seconds later, the judge enters the shop, and Sweeney lies to him, saying that Joanna escaped from the madhouse and that she's on her way here to reunite with his handsome ass. Then he convinces the judge to sit down for a shave because he needs to look best for his bride-to-be. And finally, after singing one last duet with the man who stole his life away from him, Sweeney Todd reveals his identity as Benjamin Barker and sends the judge to hell. Revenge is sweet, but it has a bitter aftertaste. Sweeney discovers Joanna hiding in the trunk and, mistaking her for a boy, throws her in his chair to give her one of his signature shaves. Remember, this is the first interaction he's had with his daughter since they were separated 15 years ago. It's fortunate that neither of them know the other's true identity, but it's tragic nonetheless. Lucky for Joanna, Sweeney's death blow is interrupted by the sound of Miss Lovett screaming, and she's able to run away. The barber then goes to the bakehouse to see what the hell is going on, and when he gets a better look at the homeless woman's face, he realizes that she was right when she said she knew him. The woman was none other than Lucy, Sweeney Todd's wife. Mrs. Lovett led the barber to believe that Lucy died after drinking poison, but she never told him the whole story. Lucy survived. She had just lost her mind. And after learning this truth, that he could have reunited with his wife and tried to help her heal instead of going on this blood-soaked quest for vengeance, he throws Mrs. Lovett in the oven just to give her a preview of where her soul is headed. Then, while Sweeney mourns over Lucy's corpse, Tobias sneaks up from behind and slits his throat, sending the barber's soul down the same chute as the baker's. And everyone lived happily ever after. Wait, that doesn't sound right. No, in this case, it seems like every character died scared, sad, and in a lot of pain. Many of them were murderers and sex criminals, so they totally deserved it, but they were still human, and seeing the misery they inflicted on others reflected back at them is somehow both satisfying and saddening. While as grand a finale as that was, it does have some stiff competition with the book's conclusion. After Sweeney committed Tobias to the madhouse, he needed a new assistant to look after his shop while he was preparing for his escape, and Joanna Oakley noticed the Help Wanted sign in the window. This was almost too perfect because she wanted to investigate Sweeney's shop after a man named Thornhill disappeared there. Thornhill was the lone survivor of the shipwreck that killed her lover, Mark Ingestry, and he was supposed to give her the news of Mark's death, as well as gift her the priceless string of pearls before Sweeney killed him and stole them. So, disguising herself as a young lad named Charlie Green, Joanna convinced Sweeney Todd to hire her, and she looked around for clues about evil goings-on there every chance she got. Which was not very often, because Todd was a paranoid dude and careful to watch what he did and said in front of her. Once again, we have some overlap with the musical. In both versions of the story, the Joanna character is forced to dress up as a lad. She does it for very different reasons, but it's incredible to me how many specific details made their way into the adaptation. Joanna doesn't end up learning a whole lot during her time as Todd's apprentice, but she does overhear one juicy conversation he has with a customer who just so happened to work for the same pawnbroker that Sweeney sold the pearls to. The customer says that he has the pearls in his possession right now and that he's in the city to try and track down the owner. Kind of ironic considering the rightful owner and previous owner are both in the same room with him at that moment. After Sweeney hears this, he realizes he could steal the pearls back from this guy and sell them elsewhere to double his profit. So he sends Joanna out of the shop to run some errands, and when she returns, the man is gone, while Sweeney is in an oddly good mood. So while Joanna is deep undercover, Colonel Jeffrey and Sir Richard Blunt are conducting their own due diligence. Jeffrey was on the boat that saved Thornhill, and Blunt was a civil officer who had a bad feeling about the barber for a while now. I believe that these characters were a loose inspiration for Judge Turpin and Beetle Bamford, because like those two, they're also authority figures who are enemies to Sweeney Todd. And similar to Turpin, the Colonel makes a pass at Joanna, who is way too young for him. But unlike the Judge, Jeffrey politely accepts the rejection and continues to help Joanna instead of letting his po widow feelings be hurt. Anyway, Blunt and Jeffrey's theory that something sinister is going down at Sweeney's shop gets confirmed when they stake out the place and witness a rich man enter but never leave. Then Blunt responds to some reports of a foul odor emanating from the vaults below St. Dunstan's church, and when he finds the source of the stench deep in the tunnels, he realizes the situation is much worse than he thought and that he needs to act fast. He and Jeffrey start putting together a plan to bust Sweeney Todd once and for all. Meanwhile, Sweeney is at Mrs. Lovett's. She called him over because her cook is no longer cooperating and needs to be dealt with. Unfortunately for Lovett, Sweeney had his own reasons for visiting. With him heading out of town, she would be expecting her half of their loot, but he didn't really feel like sharing anymore, so he snuck some rat poison into her brandy when she wasn't looking. Mr. Todd watched Lovett take a few swigs before he left her shop, promising to deal with her insubordinate employee that night. Then he goes back to his shop to resume packing, but before he can duck into his back parlor, a farmer walks through the door and insists on a shave. While the farmer's being lathered up, he tells the barber that he's in the city selling livestock and quietly mentions that he has a 500-pound banknote hidden in his boot, which was enough to convince Sweeney that he had to die. The barber excuses himself to get a new razor from the back parlor, and when he exits the room, the farmer, who's not really a farmer, stands up and watches as the platform his seat was sitting on is revealed to be on a wheel-like mechanism. It tilts backwards, sending whoever is sitting in it falling headfirst into the 20-foot abyss below it, while an identical chair bolted to the other side of the platform is pushed up to replace it. After witnessing this, the fake farmer sat back down like everything was perfectly normal, and when Sweeney Todd returned to see him still in the chair, he realized he'd just f***ed up. The farmer, who was really Sir Richard Blunt in disguise, sprang from his seat and tackled Sweeney to the ground. Then two more officers who were hiding in the cupboard jumped out to assist with the arrest. Sweeney Todd's reign of terror had finally come to an end. Joanna Oakley was now safe, and the truth about what happened to Thornhill would soon be revealed. But first, another arrest had to be made, so Richard Blunt and his squad went to Mrs. Lovett's. When they arrived, it was at the peak of Lovett's busy hour, and she was waiting on a fresh order of 100 meat pies to come up through the dumbwaiter. Only, when that hatch opened, she got a lot more than she bargained for. Her imprisoned assistant was hiding under the tray of pies, and as soon as he was in the clear, he jumped out of the dumbwaiter and made an announcement for all the customers to hear. The delicious pies they were consuming were made of human flesh. The uproar that followed this announcement was one for the ages. Customers were screaming, crying, projectile vomiting, and a policeman sent by Sir Richard stepped up to arrest Lovett. Before he could restrain her though, her eyes went wide, her skin turned purple, and she fell to the ground with a thud. Sweeney Todd's poison had just kicked in, and it killed her on the spot. A few moments later, the shop door opened and Richard Blunt entered with Joanna Oakley. She didn't want to come along, but he had insisted, and after stepping into the shop, Joanna understood why. The man standing behind the counter, Mrs. Lovett's assistant, was also Joanna's one true love, Mark Ingestry. He had survived the shipwreck that Thornhill believed he perished in and found another way back to London. He had tried to meet with Joanna when he first returned, but when he saw her talking to Colonel Jeffrey, he assumed that she moved on. So, without a penny to his name, he agreed to work at Mrs. Lovett's until he could put together a plan for what to do with his life. Of course, he didn't expect to be imprisoned there against his will, but lucky for him, Sir Richard Blunt stumbled upon the bakehouse while investigating the tunnels below St. Dunstan's church. During his sleuthing, Richard found a room full of corpses that had a barber's chair bolted into the ceiling. Then he discovered another corpse-filled room that shared a wall with the bakehouse that Mark was locked in. Richard was able to communicate a plan to Mark through a small grate, and that's how we got the theatrical reveal in Mrs. Lovett's pie shop, followed by he and Joanna's long-awaited reunion. So what happened to Sweeney Todd? Authorities found that he had murdered at least 200 people over the years, including Mark's friend Thornhill. Then, the string of pearls was rightfully placed around Joanna's neck, while a noose was tied around the barber's. Sweeney Todd was swinging dead from the gallows within a few days after his arrest. Meanwhile, Joanna and Mark would go on to get married and live happily ever after. Or would they? When I closed the String of Pearls book after reading it for the first time, it was a satisfying moment. The story was 39 chapters long, written in flowery Victorian language, and had some truly pointless side stories that didn't move the main plot along at all. But the payoff at the end made all that time I invested feel so worth it. Now imagine my surprise when I was editing part 1 of our Sweeney Todd series and stumbled upon a version of the book published online that had 134 additional chapters.
No, God! No, God, please, no! 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 No!
Obviously, I had to dig into this, and it turns out that the popularity of the String of Pearls gave its publisher, Edward Lloyd, some serious financial incentive to keep the story going. So in 1850, 3 years after the story finished its original run, he ordered for the ending to be reworked and new chapters added every week until people stopped buying them. This resulted in the 39-chapter story being stretched across 173 total chapters. And while I'm not going to bother going through all of them, there are some hysterical and horrifying highlights that I know you're going to appreciate. So there's no major differences between the original and expanded publications until Tobias's escape from the madhouse. That's when they start adding chapters following events that happened off camera in the original. Like, Tobias's adventures weren't over when he left the asylum. In this version, he was swarmed by a crowd of people after he got over the wall and was rescued by Colonel Jeffrey, who brought him to his house to recover. Meanwhile, his fellow escapee who fell from the wall suffers a terrible fate. Dr. Fogg and his assistant throw her down a well, and when she clings on to any surface she can to save herself, they chop off her hands, sending her falling into the darkness below. You know, a lot of people die in this story, but for some reason that one was the most disturbing to me. Anyway, over at the Colonel's house, Tobias is still a bit loopy after what Sweeney Todd put him through. So to shake him out of his breakdown, Tobias's mom brings over a girl who Tobias had a crush on named Mina Gray. And I've got to say that while I haven't fully read these expanded chapters, I love this character. When she sees Tobias in his sad state, she immediately feels empathetic and wants to help him. Then, when Sweeney Todd breaks into the house to kill his apprentice once and for all, she goes akimbo with 2 of the Colonel's pistols and threatens to blast his face off, giving the cowardly barber no choice but to run away. Some other scenes the expanded edition includes are when Richard Blunt found Mark Ingistry in the bakehouse connected to the vaults, Sweeney Todd walking by a poor woman whom he made a widow and her sad fatherless children, then refusing to give them any change, and a pretty hilarious moment where Todd tries to kill Lovett by pushing her out of a rowboat. Speaking of Lovett, in order to keep the story going, she is not poisoned by Sweeney Todd in the expanded edition. Instead, she's arrested. Then we're actually taken through she and the barber's trial, which Lovett avoids the results of by poisoning herself. Apparently, she was haunted by the ghosts of her victims and couldn't stand living with them any longer. Meanwhile, Sweeney tries to escape justice and kill himself on more than one occasion. First, by almost slitting his own throat with a shattered piece of pottery, and then by nearly cracking his own skull with a hammer. Each of these attempts were interrupted, but that just forced the increasingly desperate barber to find a way to escape and cause even more chaos. What ensues are a series of narrow escapes by Todd, while our steadfast heroes stay hot on his tail. And this all culminates into a horse chase where Sir Richard Blunt shoots Todd off his steed, sending him crashing onto the dirt and rocks below, breaking several of his limbs, and ultimately killing him dead. And so, the seemingly endless adventures of Sweeney Todd have finally concluded. But our series on them hasn't. Believe it or not, we still have more analysis to do, more connections to make, and of course we gotta discuss the real-world events that may have led to the Demon Barber's creation. So these claims that Sweeney Todd was a real fella have been floating around since his story, The String of Pearls, was released in its original weekly format in 1846. But not a single soul had any luck verifying these allegations until crime historian Peter Haining came along in the 1970s and 90s and released his 2 books about the true story of Sweeney Todd. He claims that Todd was born on October 26, 1756, to an impoverished family living in the East End slums. His mother was a 20-year-old silk weaver, and his father was your typical abusive alcoholic. And when Todd was just 12 years old, they abandoned him, forcing him to live like a criminal just to survive, and this ultimately landed him in Newgate Prison at the age of 14. It was at Newgate Prison that Todd held his first razor blade. He was an apprentice to the barber who shaved the heads of the inmates, and after 15 years behind bars, he was finally released. The first thing he did upon his return to London was set himself up as a barber, and soon enough, he had his own establishment on the infamous Fleet Street. Fleet Street is where Todd would carry out his sinister scheme for the next 17 years. With the help of his razor blade and his secret rotating chair platform, he murdered at least 160 of his customers. Then, using the tunnels below the London streets, he delivered their still warm bods to his partner Marjorie Lovett, who would bake them into pies. Peter Haining says that Todd's murder spree ended in 1802 when he was hanged by his neck, just like how he's executed in the original tale. But as fitting as that would be, there's basically zero evidence to support this claim, or any of his claims for that matter. Haining does cite a few historical resources, but what raises the alarm in my head is the insane level of detail he includes in his explanations while somehow managing to keep his sources as vague as possible. For example, he says that in Newgate Calendar's weekly accounts of sensational trials, they describe a man named Francis Thornhill who was commissioned to deliver a string of pearls worth £16,000 to a young woman in London. But Thornhill supposedly disappeared after stopping in Todd's shop for a shave. Now, if you've seen parts 1 and 2 of this series, you know this fits the book's plot near perfectly. The calendar also supposedly says that Todd pawned the pearls after Thornhill's disappearance, which happens in the book too. But in the book, he gets £8,000 for them, while in real life, he apparently got £1,000. Quite a bit less. As additional evidence, Haining refers to a London newspaper from the late 1700s that describes the foul odors coming out of the tunnels below St. Dunstan's Church, which Todd and Lovett used for storing and transporting all the dead bods. It turns out these tunnels really do exist and even connect to the supposed locations of where Todd and Lovett's shops were. Once again, these are some pretty convincing claims, but the problem is with his citations. There's nowhere for you and I, as readers or his fellow historians, to follow up on them. He doesn't tell us how he got access to these 200-year-old criminal reports, newspapers, and maps, or even the specific dates of the publication, so we'd at least know where to look for them. And he doesn't even quote them directly. He just paraphrases what he claims to have read from them, meaning that we have to simply take him at his word and trust completely that he's accurately interpreting and transcribing the meaning of these rare and historical documents that no one has ever seen before. So let's push Haining's claims aside for a second. Or forever, I don't really care. Were there any other candidates for the real-life Sweeney and Lovett? It turns out, yes. We also found a few allegations online that the true Barber Baker barbarians lived in 1300s Paris. But at risk of repeating myself, there's almost exactly zero proof to support this theory, though you can find a pretty convincing article over on messynessychic.com. A scholarly name if there ever was one. To be honest, I found this article to be equal parts infuriating and hilarious. Like, the author tells this long-winded story about a butcher barber who was in cahoots with the woman who owned the pie shop next to his business, and how for 3 years he ground up the customers he murdered for her to cook into tasty treats. They even go so far as to say the reason the barber was caught was because a family dog was left waiting for its owner outside the shop, and this led the victim's wife to go to the law and start an investigation. Sounds pretty similar to the book, right? But they do put a more gruesome twist on this story's ending. After the murderers are caught, they're burned alive to cleanse the city of their evil auras. And soon after, a bronze dog statue was erected on the street corner to honor the pup. I'll admit, I kind of want this one to be real just for the dog statue, but when I tried to look into it elsewhere, I couldn't find any record of such a monument being built, nor did the author tell us where they found all this info. But wait, because it all comes together in the conclusion. The author says, "As I went to investigate, I caught the eye of a young officer. Assuming I was lost and had a question about directions, I caught him off guard when I asked him about the infamous murders and if the story was true. With a surprised look and a glint in his eye, he told me that that was the legend, and some of the old building remained in the depths of the garage." Ah yes, the old glint in the eye. All the proof you need, right? I'm pretty sure that's how they busted John Wayne Gacy. But it gets better, Solo fam, because there's another article over on historythings.com that tells us the same story. And they actually give us a source. You want to know what it is? Their source is the Messy Nessie Chic article. I wish I was making that up, but god damn is it true. This entry has an even better ending though. The author says, while today the streets in the area of Paris stand as if nothing ever happened, they were once the home of something a lot more sinister. All you need to do is look a little deeper into the history books to find the real event that inspired the chilling tale. Let me repeat that. All you have to do is look a little deeper into the history books to find the real event. Kind of ironic to include that considering that no history books were used in the making of this article. Also, what history books are we talking about? There's kind of a lot of those. No, it seems to me that as much as the internet wants Sweeney Todd to be based on a real-life serial killer, which is kind of fucked up by the way, there's just not enough evidence to support even the weakest hypothesis. I'll admit, it's still totally possible that an event like this happened and all the records of it have just been lost to the sands of time, but with how unique and well publicized the event would have been, you'd think that by now someone out there would have found a scrap of newspaper or a prison record that mentioned these monsters. Unfortunately, that just isn't the case, but it turns out that the history of Sweeney Todd goes deeper than the Penny Dreadful series. Actually, people have been talking about the Butcher Barber since before the String of Pearls was ever published. You might be surprised to hear this, but we may actually know the first person to claim that Sweeney Todd was based on a real person. I want to be clear though that our resource for this information is an article from PBS that also doesn't cite its sources, so take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. Now, one thing that we know for sure is that the first stage adaptation of Sweeney Todd was created by a playwright named George Pitt, and he didn't even wait for the story's ending to be released before he adapted it. He just went ahead and wrote his own. The claim this article makes, which we couldn't find a way to prove, is that a year after the play opened, Pitt started advertising it as founded on fact. Reflexively, I want to say this is a simple case of false advertising, but in Pitt's defense, he may have really believed it. Because in the centuries before the play opened, and before the Penny Dreadful was ever written, the Sweeney Todd story had been passed around as an urban legend, although he hadn't been given his name just yet. We know this because in 1844, 2 years before the String of Pearls debuted, Charles Dickens published his novel Martin Chuzzlewit, and in this novel he references, quote, those preparers of cannibalistic pastry who are represented in many country legends as doing a lively retail business in the metropolis. But it also sounds like there may have been more than one version of the legend depending on who is telling it and where they were from. Now, wouldn't you be curious to hear how those other versions unfolded? Well, we do actually have a written record of one of them, and it was created in the 1650s, almost 200 years before Martin Chuzzlewit's publication. In the diary of a Swedish traveler named Peter Lindström, who was on an expedition to the Swedish settlements in America, he wrote about a story he heard while in Calais, northern France. The story was about a barber who had a special hatch that he would sit his customers on top of, and when he stomped his foot, the hatch would open, dropping them into the cellar below as he simultaneously slit their throats. The entry even mentions the plot to turn his victims into pies that his partner, the baker, would sell. Only in this case, the baker was a man, and the story took place in Calais. Now I know what you're thinking. Could Lindström's tale be referring to the same French killers that those articles from earlier were talking about? And yeah, it very well could be. Granted, the article said the killers were in Paris, but that's an easy detail to get twisted up in the grapevine. It should be noted that Peter Lindström didn't bother to mention how he stumbled upon this story, so we don't know if he heard it in a pub or read it in a newspaper. So that sucks. But even if he does happen to be referring to the same legend that those articles were, it still doesn't change the fact that some guy's eye-twinkling and history book are not valid citations. Now, I might be coming off as a grumpy goose who doesn't want people to have fun with their fan theories, but just to be clear, I am willing to entertain that parts of the Sweeney Todd story could have been based on real events. I just think it needs to be made more clear that these are theories, not proven facts. It's just like the people who desperately want to believe that the Muffin Man was a serial killer with a passion for pastry. I can't tell you how many bogus TikToks and podcasts I've come across that claim this one is real, despite the only known source for the story being a parody website called Uncyclopedia.
This happened in the 1800s. His name was Frederick Thomas Limwood.
Okay.
This is the first ever serial killer that they know about.
What the fuck?
Yeah. Literally, this is true. This is literally what happened.
Yeah.
Literally, this is true. This is literally what happened.
Yeah.
This is true. This is true.
Let me tell you something, folks. You can't fix stupid.
You know what the biggest shame of it is though? People are so focused on trying to find proof of a murderous Barber-Baker duo that they completely overlook that people in Victorian England actually were eating dead bodies and were fully aware of it. In their defense, I'm also guilty of overlooking this on my first run-through of the Sweeney Todd story, but just when I thought Victorian England couldn't get any weirder, I learned about the practice of medical cannibalism. The belief that consuming parts of the human body can heal your own. To be fair, this belief was around long before the Victorian era, but when the belief got intertwined with the Victorian elite's obsession with ancient Egypt, it had some bizarre results. Because by the 19th century, it was already common practice for wealthy Brits to return home from excursions in Egypt and host a kind of unwrapping party, where they would show off the loot they took from the tombs. But how did they take the leap from simply unwrapping embalmed bodies to reheating and serving them? A substance called mumia is to blame for that. This was a waxy substance that exuded out of the black rock asphalt that made up the Persian mountainside, and it was prized for its healing qualities. But when Western Europeans began encountering the Islamic world and translating its texts, 11th and 12th century translators incorrectly identified mumia as a substance exuded from preserved bodies in Egyptian tombs. Here's where it gets nasty. Now, as you can imagine, there were not enough mummies in all of Egypt to satisfy Britain's demands, and this is where some shady Sweeney Todd-like business goes down. Similar to how Lovett would use Todd's customers/victims as the secret ingredient in her delicious meat pies, body snatchers and other lowly characters would create mummies of their own from the fresh cadavers and bodies of executed criminals, slaves, and more, sneaking through the darkness of night to steal them from the graveyards and gallows. The snatchers would then give the body a great value mummification, embalming it with salt and drugs before drying it in an oven and grounding it into powder that apothecaries added to their home remedies. As gross as it sounds to ingest any part of a dead body, unless you're Armie Hammer, I think it's somehow made worse by the fact that these Brits were consuming their local criminals when they thought they were getting authentic Egyptian mumia. But regardless of whether or not Sweeney Todd or someone like him was real, you can't help but wonder, why was this story so popular to begin with? And what exactly have audiences been getting out of it for the past 300 years, outside of satisfying their morbid curiosity? At the fundamental level, I think it's a warning to be careful about who you trust and to always pay attention to your surroundings. Keep in contact with your loved ones as much as possible so they know what you're up to, and hey, maybe take a friend with you when you go to your new barber. But you can extrapolate different meanings from the different versions. The Penny Dreadful has those messages in it, but it also shows the consequences of unfettered greed. Greed brings misery to everyone it touches, and in the end, it doesn't even get the big payout that it caused all that misery for. The stage play is more of a cautionary tale about revenge and the consequences of taking justice into your own hands. Sweeney was so blinded with rage that he murdered the woman that he thought he needed to avenge. I think another reason that The String of Pearls was so popular with audiences after finally being put into print was because of the time period. London was in the thick of its industrialization, with tons of new residents from out in the country moving into the city to work in the factories. People were more stacked on top of each other than ever, and many went from knowing the farmers and butchers that supplied their food personally to being unsure of where their food came from. This fear of transactional anonymity that was made possible by the dense populations was reflected in the story about the barber and baker, and so it resonated with many of the people reading it, which were mostly the aforementioned newcomers to London, making Todd's choice of victims, lone travelers and migrants, people isolated or estranged from their family and friends, even more terrifying. It showed the readers just how vulnerable they were to becoming nameless murder victims who could disappear without a trace. And that will do it for the uncut edition of the very messed up origins of Sweeney Todd, as I originally intended. For those who don't know, when I originally committed to covering Sweeney Todd a couple of years ago, I planned on doing it all in one episode, but this rabbit hole went way deeper than I originally thought, and so I had to cut it into 3 separate parts. I know that some people get annoyed when I post compilations of old episodes, but I think this one is pretty justified. Plus, I got to add that bit at the end about rich Brits eating corpses, which more people need to know about. If you made it to this point in the episode though, just know I appreciate you, and I want to hear from you in the comments. Which version of the Sweeney Todd story do you like best? And do you buy that he's based on a real serial killer, or did I talk you out of it? I'll see you next week with a brand new Messed Up Origins episode that none of you could have predicted. Until then, my name is John Solo, and remember, John shot first.